Chapter 12. Simon Blake, who also sent Boris Pavlov off a few minutes after Kyla Fisher, took care of his works at the university until the late afternoon. It was 7:30 p.m. when he left his room to return home. After walking 3/4 of the way down a gentle downhill road to the main exit of the campus, Blake turned left to reach the wide opening usually used by university staff to park their vehicles. He found his vehicle. A minute later, he nodded to the only security guard waiting at the entrance gate of the university at that hour and left the school. Even though it was evening, it was still warm. The humid air made the heat more sweltering. After covering a few frustrating distances in heavy city traffic, which at times moved quite slowly, Blake took the bend that led to his home on the banks of the Potomac River. From this point on, an atmosphere prevailed, where traffic and everything made by man decreased, and natural beauties came to the fore. Blake loved it. It was getting slightly dark. Simon Blake had about 20 minutes ahead of him. For the last 15 kilometers, he continued on his way at an average speed, unaware that he was being followed. On a section of the curved road that runs parallel to the river, narrowing and widening in places, where vehicular traffic was becoming sparse, Blake noticed that a large black Jeep with dark windows suddenly appeared and began to squeeze him from behind. At first, he thought that the vehicle behind him was in a hurry and was trying to overtake him. Reducing his speed, he put his left hand out of the window and motioned for the man to pass. In response, the man suddenly increased his speed and hit Blake's bumper hard. Shaken, Blake seemed to lose control of his car for a few seconds, then recovered. It was now clear that the intentions of the person behind him were not good. Blake tried to increase his speed to clear the gap to the vehicle that was following him, but the narrow and winding road did not allow him to do so. The two vehicles continued on the road for a while, with a distance of no more than a few meters. In a place where the road partially widened, the black Jeep suddenly swerved to the left and increased its speed. The two vehicles were now running side by side and covering the entire road. "Damn, what's wrong with you?" Blake sighed that they had angered someone sooner than he expected. At least he now knew that Kyla Fisher wasn't paranoid. The Jeep continued to drive in the left lane of the road and swerved to the left in an attempt to throw Blake off the road. On his first try he failed. As he prepared for the second, he noticed a light-colored pickup truck coming towards him from the opposite lane. The man was honking his horn with all his might. In a deft maneuver, he slowed down and moved into the right lane behind Blake. He didn't care about the profanity he hurled at the driver of the pickup truck as he passed by and opened his window. From the rearview mirror, Blake saw the Jeep accelerate again. The Jeep steered to move into the left lane, then something completely unexpected happened. The black Jeep with dark-tinted windows first slowed down, then made a sudden U-turn, crossed into the opposite lane and soon disappeared from sight. Blake took a deep breath and wiped away the sweat that had accumulated on his forehead. When he reached his house 10 minutes later, his head was cracking with pain. He took a cold shower, drank painkillers and threw himself on the bed. Chapter 13. Dorian Fisher was about to complete his 4th year at Northwest University, where he was pursuing as a doctoral student. He was due to submit his dissertation in September, i.e. 2 months later. In the first year of his doctorate, he almost abandoned his education because his stars did not reconcile with his advisor, Professor Sabrina Maxwell. The woman was literally paranoid and was constantly picking fights. Luckily, Professor Tyler Benson came to Dorian's aid. Dorian had rented a small but luxurious student house within walking distance of the university. He had been living here alone for the past 4 years. Thanks to his father's financial means, he did not have to work to pay rent or pay for other expenses. He did not have to go to school often at the thesis stage. He was content with the life he lived. Temporarily. That day, he left his house to go to Professor Benson's house to discuss the final revisions to his dissertation. He would use his bicycle for transportation. As he was about to put his helmet on his head, he heard the sound of his phone ringing. It was Kyla who called. Again, thinking that there was something to do with company matters, he reluctantly opened it. "Hi Dorian. How are you?" "I'm fine. I was just about to leave." "What happened? Did Richards call again?" "That's not the point. Listen, do you remember that policeman and teacher friend I told you about?" Dorian rolled his eyes. "Again?" "Yes, of course. So what?" "They want to talk to you." "With me? Is that necessary?" "Yes." "When?" "When is the earliest?" Dorian thought for a few seconds. "Not before the weekend. And I have to come back on Monday. You know I'm busy right now. So I can only take time on Saturday or Sunday." "Well, I'll get back to you. See you soon." When Dorian got on his bike and hit the road, he had something else going through his mind. Chapter 14. Simon Blake doubted he could make it happen. He opened the door of the plane. It was empty inside. Who was it going to be, anyway? He moved into the cockpit and settled into the seat. As a matter of fact, he had no training in piloting. Even as a passenger, air travel was something he chose only when he had to. But this time it was different. It was as if someone was telling him what to do. His hands knew what had to be done spontaneously. He thought to himself, if I knew it was so easy, I would have been a pilot. Less than a minute later, he took the plane into the air. There was light and fresh air. He was having a lot of fun and feeling liberated. Then, before he had a chance to understand what was happening, the plane plunged into the storm. Blake felt himself begin to swerve. It was the end of it. At the same time, the door of the cockpit opened. He thought he was alone on the plane. He looked behind him to see who the intruder was who had entered. There was no one. Suddenly, he was startled by the sight of someone talking. On the other hand, he was trying not to lose control of the plane. I know who did it. What a strange sound it was. The voice, which was not clear where it came from, continued to speak. The same thing will happen to you. In an instant, Blake felt hotter than he had ever been in his life. He turned around again to see the owner of the voice. This time he looked down instinctively. It was a baby a few months old at most who spoke. And a dead baby. God, how is this possible? And he saw that his right arm began to burn like coals. She woke up screaming. What a terrible dream it was. He looked at his watch. 11 o'clock. He was surprised that he had slept until this hour. He got up and went under the cold shower. 15 minutes later, while she was making herself coffee, her phone rang. It was Pavlov who called. Hi Simon, how are you? If you have time today, I'd like to introduce you to Jimmy. Chapter 15. On the afternoon of the same day, Blake and Pavlov arrived in the Anacostia neighborhood, which consisted mostly of old or abandoned buildings with a historical texture. The vast multi-story building, which looked like it was from the 1940s or 50s and gave the impression that it would collapse at the slightest tremor, was surrounded by rusty wire fences that served as a garden wall. The apartment building, which looked like something out of a horror movie, was surrounded by haphazardly discarded junk, garbage, neglected bushes and grass. Blake and Pavlov parked their cars outside the fence. After getting out of his vehicle, Pavlov looked around for a while. It had been more than a year since he had last been here. He couldn't be sure where the entrance was. Then he began to move to the left, following the fence. Arriving here for the first time, Blake followed his friend. Pavlov opened the rusty chain, which appeared to be wrapped around the door, to give the impression that it was locked. When he barely dragged the door open, the two friends were startled by the sound of the dog suddenly starting barking. They were relieved to see that the not-so-hospitable German shepherd 20 yards in front of them was tightly bound. As far as could be seen from the windows of the building, there were not many people living inside. Blake thought that at least half of the apartment building was empty. They entered the apartment through the main entrance door. It smelled of dampness inside. Apparently, there were 4 apartments on each floor. On the right side were the stairs. Instead of going up the stairs, Pavlov began to go down. Blake followed. That young fellow, I think, is more interesting than I thought he was. Pavlov smiled and said, You'll decide that in a moment. When they went downstairs, the smell of dampness became more pronounced. There was only one apartment on the ground floor which was poorly lit. Pavlov rang the doorbell. But instead of a ringtone, he received a voice command requesting an iris scan for biometric authentication. Come on. Jimmy seems to have a very developed sense of humor. It seems to me more like someone with a lot of paranoia. Pavlov found the solution by calling Jimmy Perkins. Hi Jimmy. We stand in front of the door. Will you let us in if you don't mind it? Please use one of the fingerprint or iris scanning methods. Look at me, you fucker, are you kidding me? Of course I'm kidding, big man. Don't get angry right away, wait 2 seconds, I'm going to turn it on. From behind the door, several different locks were heard. Immediately after, the old door creaked open, contrasting with the state-of-the-art devices mounted on it. Behind the door appeared a swarthy man of about 35 years of age, tall, thin, with long hair and thick glasses. Hi Boris, come on in. Blake's eye was caught by cameras and motion sensors placed in every corner of the house. They moved to the largest of the rooms. In the space, which turned out to be a study room, there were 2 large desks, monitors of different sizes and models on the tables, advanced computers and private servers, and many other technological trinkets. It was clear that Perkins spent most of his time alone writing code and dealing with security systems. On the left side of the tables were augmented reality systems, which Blake guessed the young man used to simulate complex attack scenarios and identify security vulnerabilities. Adjacent to the wall on the right, in addition to all this technological crowd, there was also a library that kept books on the same topics and Jimmy's doodles. Jimmy Perkins gestured to the chairs in his room and said, "Sit down. I think that's your teacher friend Blake, whom you told me about." Simon Blake nodded in agreement. "Hi Jimmy, how are you?" They quickly passed the introductory chapter. Pavlov told Perkins about the death of Ray Fisher, the incidents of spontaneous combustion, the unexpected visit of Kyla Fisher, and other developments. "And that's the part of it that is up to me to infiltrate this biotech company and find out what the hell this guy called Aldrich Kohler is up to," Pavlov said. "Well, you don't have to. Do you have any idea how to do this?" Simon Blake replied. "Actually, I have something on my mind," and told both Boris Pavlov and Jimmy Perkins what he thought. After listening carefully to Blake, Pavlov said, "That sounds logical. At least in theory. But if the technical side of it can be overcome, I guess Jimmy will have to answer that." Perkins replied to the major. "Boris, it's as easy for me as buying milk at the grocery store." The two friends stayed at Perkins' house for about an hour, pondering the details, and then left. Pavlov asked, "Do you think it will work?" "We have no choice but to hope so," Blake said. "And that Perkins looks like a very resourceful guy." At the same time, Pavlov's phone rang. "Hello, Mrs. Fisher. Thank you, I'm fine." "Is that so? Good. Wait a second, please, I have to ask Simon about this." Pavlov turned to Blake and said, "The caller, Kyla Fisher, says her brother can meet us on Saturday. He could come to college in your room. Are you eligible?" she asked. Blake nodded by closing and opening his eyes in a yes. "We'll be waiting in Blake's room on Saturday," Pavlov said, turning to Kyla Fisher, who was waiting on the phone. After Pavlov hung up, Blake told his friend what had happened to him the previous evening. "You had a chance. I think they just wanted to intimidate?" "Probably yes. Or more likely, there was a change in their plans at the last moment?" "Perhaps." "Were you able to get the license plate of the car?" "Unfortunately, no." "You're welcome. They have already used fake license plates." "Well, if we look at the positive side of things, we're pretty sure Kyla Fisher isn't dreaming anymore." Chapter 16. On Saturday, Dorian Fisher was sitting in Simon Blake's room at the university, in the same chair that his sister had sat in a few days earlier. Dorian was a thin, long dark hair, pale-skinned, spectacled and goatee. They were about 180 centimeters tall. The style of clothing was reminiscent of the rockers of the 90s. The University of Washington, where Blake worked, and Northwest University, where Dorian earned his PhD, were close to each other. So they decided to meet in Blake's room. Pavlov asked the first questions. "You know Kyla's allegations. Do you share her thoughts?" "In a way." "Why did you mean in a way?" Unlike Kyla Fisher, Dorian gave the impression of being a very serious temperament, distant and controlled. He seemed to be planning in advance every single word he was going to say before he spoke. "Kyla shared her thoughts with me right after my dad's death. It didn't seem unreasonable to me. However, even if I agree with her, I cannot be as assertive as she is. For the past 8 years, I have lived partially separated from my family. I usually stayed only at the mansion on weekends and spent most of my time in the house I kept. Kyla, on the other hand, was constantly in the same house with Tabitha after the death of my father and mother. To make a long story short, Kyla's ideas need to be clearer." "I see. Where were you on the day your father passed away?" Kyla informed me of the situation over the phone. "I was at Professor Tyler Benson's house that day. I went to Benson's house to work on my thesis. We normally meet once or twice a week in Mr. Benson's room at school, but he was at home because he didn't have class that day." "All right. Have you noticed anything unusual in your father's behavior lately?" Dorian Fisher thought again for a moment before speaking. "Maybe. I'm not sure if this can be considered something out of the ordinary, but my dad seemed to be over-energized in the last few months. In your opinion, what was the reason for this?" "I'm not sure. Kyla had told me that my father had started taking some over-the-counter medications at Tabitha's insistence. Frankly, I haven't seen these drugs. If your sister's opinion that your father was murdered is true, who do you think could have killed him besides Tabitha Fisher?" "I can't name you, but it could be someone from the business world or any woman my dad was with." Pavlov paused as if trying to make sure he didn't miss something. Then he continued. "Do you know someone named Rusty Richards?" "Yes. He is the son of my father's ex-partner. He's in a strong position in the company now and I think he wants to be the new boss." Blake listened intently to Pavlov and Dorian's conversations, occasionally writing or drawing something in his notebook in front of him, then continuing to listen. "My father's field of work is not for me. Therefore, I have no ambition to replace him after his death. Richards and Kyla are in touch about it. They are trying to handle the sale of our family shares. That's fine with me too." Pavlov turned to Blake and pointed to Dorian Fisher out of the corner of his eye, as if to say, "It's your turn?" Blake's first question surprised Dorian a bit. "What is the subject of your doctoral dissertation, Mr. Fisher?" "My thesis is on the genetic basis of neurodegenerative diseases, Mr. Blake." "What did you write your master's thesis on?" "On the study of gene editing technologies." "What do you plan professionally for the future after submitting your thesis?" "I'm thinking of becoming an academic or starting a company related to the health sector." "How do you spend your free time?" "I don't have a lot of free time. I spend as much as I can reading, listening to classical or rock music, riding my bike, and sometimes playing strategy games on the computer." "I see. Have you seen the photos of Ray Fisher after the accident?" "I asked the authorities to do so, but they said they couldn't share it with me." "Did they explain why they didn't do that?" "They said it would affect me bad psychologically." "Well, thank you, Mr. Fisher. You have helped us a lot. Is there anything else you want to ask, Boris?" "Nope." There was a short silence. Dorian Fisher looked at Blake as if to say, "Is that what you were going to ask?" Blake continued, "Your sister has probably mentioned, I will often come and go to your house as Mrs. Kyla Fisher's art teacher for a while, without talking to Tabitha Fisher without arousing suspicion, and to examine the place where your father lives." Dorian Fisher, assuming that Blake made this statement as a question sentence, said, "Of course. If my father was indeed the victim of a murder, I would support any step you take to find those responsible." "Very nice, Mr. Fisher. Hope to see you again soon." Chapter 17. The protocol for safe access to the building for Asclepios and Company's employees consisted of 3 distinct phases. The company employee first had his ID card, which works with RFID technology, verified, then subjected to retinal scanning, only to reach the security guard who was on guard at the entrance of the interior. The security guard would manually follow the procedures he deemed necessary depending on the situation. For example, in order to prevent the entry of unauthorized materials, he would search the person who wanted to enter as he saw fit, check his identity information on the computer, or ask some questions. Arriving for the first time at the entrance of the magnificent building of the biotechnology company on Monday morning, the tall young cleaning worker passed through all these stages without any problems with a very calm attitude. So far so good. On the face of it, a cleaner was not a priority or a problem for anyone. This situation may have been considered a sad fact from the point of view of sociological science, but in the current situation Jimmy Perkins was happy with it. Over the past few days, thanks to his extraordinary cybernetic skills, he had hacked into Asclepios and Company's security system, figured out exactly how it worked, logged in fake data identifying him as an employee of the company, and psychologically prepared himself for what followed. The system couldn't figure out that something was wrong. He was confident about it. Only a human could recognize that he was an intruder, which was a risk to take, but for now no one had even made eye contact with him. Perkins had learned in advance that Dr. Aldrich Kohler's room was on the 3rd floor. He didn't think it was right to rush to act. He had to get used to the environment first. Chapter 18. Simon Blake used his personal computer to reread all the articles he could find about what had happened to Ray Fisher and to examine the images. There was one thing that puzzled him, and his instincts told him that this detail could be the key to clarifying things. Blake carefully read the wording used in newspaper headlines on the internet and took notes about which agencies served the images. Later he watched the news published on the subject on YouTube. He scribbled something in his notebook. He compared what he read and watched with the testimony of Megan Cole, Kyla Fisher, and Dorian Fisher. He could not find an answer to the question he asked, but he remembered that he had an old acquaintance who he hoped could help him with this. "I hope I didn't delete the phone number." A few seconds later, when he saw the name on the phone number, he smiled slightly and pressed call. Chapter 19. The high walls that protected Ray Fisher's majestic manor like a fortress and surrounded the extensive garden gave the building an air of mystery even in the summer heat. The only entrance to the garden was through a huge metallic door between 2 large marble columns. A 24-hour security guard was waiting in the security booth just inside the gate. It was approaching 5 p.m. when Simon Blake arrived at Fisher's home. He likened the man's house to Bruce Wayne's mansion in the Batman movie starring Michael Keaton, which he watched in the 80s. And a little bit of Charles Augustus Milverton's mansion in the TV series Jeremy Brett as Sherlock Holmes. When Travis Goff saw the approaching vehicle, he pressed the button that allowed the garden gate to open. The door opened slowly and creakingly. The vehicle entered through the garden gate. "Hi, my name is Simon Blake. I'm Miss Kyla Fisher's teacher." The elderly security guard gestured to the right side of the 2 dirt roads that curve on either side of the pool in the middle of the garden and said, "Here you are, Mr. Blake. Mrs. Fisher is waiting for you." Blake continued by thanking the security guard. Seconds later, he was in front of the stately home of the businessman who was no longer alive. He got out of his vehicle. Trying to convince himself that what he was undertaking was sensible and necessary, he reached out his hand to knock at the door, but before he had a chance to touch it, it opened. "Welcome, Mr. Blake. I've been waiting for you." "Hello, Miss Fisher. How are you?" The young woman was dressed in a sleeveless t-shirt and a daring leather skirt. She seemed to be able to overcome the loss of her father without taking painting lessons. Once again, Blake had the feeling that something wasn't right. He had learned to trust his intuition by paying the price for not doing so at one time. "Relax, Blake, Tabitha is hungover again. I think she sleeps upstairs. There is no one else in the house either. Would you have something to drink? Something cold would be nice. Since it's calm, let me take advantage of the opportunity to see the surroundings." "Sure. Come with me, let's go to the kitchen together." Kyla Fisher made her way past the large hall to the kitchen directly opposite the main entrance door of the house. Blake studied his surroundings as carefully as he could as he followed the young woman. On the ground floor of the opulent house there was a large hall for entertaining guests, a reading room, a servant's quarter, a storage room, and a dining room combined with a large kitchen. On the walls of the hall were photographs that appeared to belong to Ray Fisher. In some of these, Fisher was seen fishing, in others he was seen receiving various awards from some media outlets. None of the family members were in the photos as far as Blake could see. Two large-scale paintings made in the abstract expressionist style, reminiscent of the works of Jackson Pollock, caught Blake's attention. He wasn't sure if a man like Fisher was interested in such artwork consciously or to show off to his friends. One way or another, there was no doubt that the man loved to show off. The stuffed deer head hanging on the wall said that fish wasn't the only thing Fisher loved to hunt. Kyla took the juice out of the fridge and handed it to Blake. Blake took a sip of his drink. "Does Tabitha Fisher know I'm coming here? I mentioned it yesterday but it didn't quite happen. Does she usually sleep during these hours?" "Not necessarily. You never know what she's going to do when. I think you have a room reserved for servants but I didn't see anyone in the house. He was there until a few days ago but he left. We haven't found anyone new yet." "I understand. Is the security guard staying here? Is it old Travis?" "No. He prefers to stay in his own house. He lives nearby. I'm guessing he didn't take it on alone." "You're right. 12 hours a day are here. We have another employee for the other 12 hours. Until my father's death, I didn't think we had any reason to be so cautious. But," Blake interjected when he noticed the young woman's pensive gaze, "I want to take a look at the upper floors while no one is around. Alone if possible. Then we'll start the lesson." "As you wish, Mr. Blake." Simon Blake left his half-drunk juice glass on the large kitchen counter and made his way to the side of the living room. Through the hall, he headed for the stairs leading to the upper floors. When he went up to the second floor, he saw that the environment was quite dark compared to the ground floor. On either side of the narrow corridor were numerous doors leading to rooms that Blake estimated to be relatively small. Tabitha Jenkins Fisher should have been behind one of them. Instead of immediately entering one of the rooms, Simon Blake first quietly walked through the dimly lit corridor. Then he decided to enter the one on the right side of the two opposite rooms at the end of the corridor, furthest from the stairs. It was a purely instinctive choice. As he quietly turned the handle of the door, he wondered why he hadn't asked Kyla Fisher which room was Tabitha's. Chapter 20. Jimmy Perkins spent the first half of the day in the vast hallways of his biotech company, doing what a real cleaner would do, wiping floors. In the afternoon, when he felt a little more attuned to the environment, he went up to the third floor. Perkins could feel like he was almost starting to have fun. He walked around the third floor of the giant building with calm steps, cleaning supplies in his hands and a jersey on. While doing this, he tried not to attract attention and glanced at the names written on the rooms, most of which consisted of laboratories. When he was finally sure that he had found the right room, he began to wipe the floors, taking care to keep a distance of 10 or 15 feet from the door. The real exciting part of the job was that it would start after working hours. While observing the people coming in and out of the laboratory, he wished that he could find what he was looking for here and get the job done without further ado. Chapter 21. When Simon Blake opened the door, he was relieved to see that the room was empty. The room, which was about 40 or 50 square meters, appeared to have belonged to Dorian Fisher. The room was tidy. At first glance, it was clear that it was no longer used by anyone all the time. Their curtains were closed. The furniture in the room, which consisted of an empty desk, a bed, a half-emptied bookcase and a wardrobe, had begun to gather dust. There was no carpet on the floors. Blake walked in and closed the door. Looking at the condition of the half-abandoned room, he thought it unlikely that he could make any tangible inferences about the owner's life. First he browsed the books. He then inspected Dorian Fisher's bed. Finally he headed to the wardrobe. The doors of the large cabinet, made of quality wood material, creaked slightly as they opened. The cupboard was empty, except for hangers of various kinds and a suit. Blake bent down slightly to open the drawers at the bottom of the section of the closet reserved for hanging clothes. 5 of the 6 drawer compartments were almost completely empty. But what he found in one of them surprised Blake. After carefully examining what he had found, he carefully removed some part of it that he thought might be of use to him, and placed it in his pocket. He put the rest of it back where he found it. After taking one last careful look inside, he decided that his work here was done, and left the room to continue his stroll. Tabitha Fisher slept in one of the rooms on the second floor when he decided he couldn't comfortably continue his strange stroll here. There was no reason for him to hurry. He would have time to go all over the house and talk to anyone who might have a connection to what was happening. After going up to the 3rd floor just to take a look, he left the search around for later. What he had just found was perhaps too important for him to dig through the house. When he came downstairs 10 minutes later, Kyla was lying on one of the sofas in the living room, staring at her smartphone. "Do you like our house?" Blake smiled. "Let's move on to the lesson if you like, Mrs. Fisher. Have you set a place for this?" "I think the best place for this will be the library. If you don't mind, of course." "The library is okay, Mrs. Fisher." The reading room was quite large and bright. The bookcase, which was made of old but expensive material that would cover 2 of the high walls from end to end, contained mostly novels and monthly magazines. The reading table and comfortable chairs placed lengthwise in the middle of the room gave the impression that they were not used very often. The other 2 walls of the room, which was roughly 60 square meters in Blake's estimation, were larger than the other 2 paintings, with romantic-style oil paintings depicting old-fashioned ships and the sea, and a state-of-the-art TV adorned the narrower wall. The big-screen television and the comfy sofa in front of it stood out from the rest of the room.